Svetlana came back home after spending some time at her parents' house. Pregnancy had already started making her tired, but she didn't let that stop her from taking care of her father, who was slowly fading away. Her mother was in the hospital, and Svetlana took it upon herself to manage everything, despite her own health issues. Watching her father struggle through his illness tore her apart, making every visit emotionally draining. As she stepped into her apartment, the heavy smell of an unclean litter box hit her nose, mixed with the stale stench of dirty laundry. Once again, Mike hadn't bothered to clean up his socks, leaving them in the usual scattered mess for her to pick up later. Irritation bubbled up inside her. "Mike, you home?" she called out, walking through the bedroom, her eyes catching sight of more clothes thrown haphazardly around. The TV in the living room was still on, flickering silently, with takeout boxes strewn across the coffee table. Where could he be? She thought to herself, noticing his shoes by the door and his jacket hanging neatly on the hook. But no Mike. Svetlana paused, listening. Sounds were coming from the bathroom. But something about those sounds told her that Mike wasn't showering. Urgency overcame her. She couldn't wait any longer, the baby pushing on her bladder. "Mike, are you gonna be in there long? I need to use the bathroom." She knocked on the door, but it wasn't locked. She pushed it open and froze in place. Mike stood there, in front of his tablet, completely engrossed in a video call with some random woman who was in a state of undress, performing acts that left no room for imagination. He hadn't even noticed her standing there. For a moment, Svetlana was paralyzed with shock. Her mind refused to process what she was seeing. Then, with a sharp movement, she slammed the door shut and covered her face with her hands, trying to regain her composure. "Susie, you're back already?" came Mike's voice from behind the door. He hurriedly pulled on his shorts, acting like nothing was wrong. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming home? How could you?" Her voice was full of rage and disbelief. Mike furrowed his brow, as if he genuinely didn't understand the problem. "What? What are you talking about? I saw everything." Svetlana couldn't believe he was trying to play dumb. Mike shrugged nonchalantly, like it was no big deal. "Oh, come on," he said, waving it off. "You left for a few days, and you're always tired or sick. I'm a man, I need to de-stress somehow. It's not like I cheated." "What? Are you serious?" Svetlana was in utter disbelief. "It's just entertainment," he continued, as if convincing himself. "I don't even know this chick, I'll never meet her. It's all online. What's the big deal?" With another dismissive wave, he headed back to the TV as though the conversation was over. But for Svetlana, it had only just begun. She stood there, staring at the bathroom door, her entire world spinning out of control. The first thought that stormed into her mind was to pack her things and leave. Her heart was pounding, hands trembling, and it felt like a hurricane had erupted inside her. Her brain frantically shuffled through the options: walk out on him, never look back, or scream so loud that his indifference would crumble under the weight of her fury. But instinct, or maybe the remnants of her sanity, pushed her to take a deep breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, until her breathing steadied and her racing thoughts slowed just enough to stop her from falling apart. It felt as though if she didn't leave right now, she would be consumed by her own bitterness and hurt. But instead of letting the situation spiral, Svetlana made a choice that surprised even herself. She called a cab. Without a word, she sat in the back seat, barely holding back her tears, and whispered the address of the hospital where her mother was staying. Her soul felt like it was breaking apart, but she needed someone, anyone, to offer advice, even if it would be bitter. When she arrived, her face streaked with tears, standing at the doorway of her mother's hospital room, her mom immediately noticed her distress. "What's wrong, Sue?" her mother asked, eyes full of concern. Svetlana collapsed onto the edge of the couch, unable to hold it in any longer. Her chest tightened with the weight of her grief, and words came tumbling out of her mouth before she could stop them. She spilled everything that had happened with Mike, not holding back, though the shame of admitting it to her mother stung like a fresh wound. Each word felt like pouring acid on her pain. Her mother listened silently, letting Svetlana empty her heart without interruption. Then a long silence followed. It felt like time had stopped, the pause between them stretching on for what seemed like an eternity. "Are you sure?" her mother finally asked quietly, her voice tinged with doubt. "Yes." Svetlana's voice trembled with the tears she was trying to hold back, fury and disbelief coursing through her. Her mother took a deep breath, sitting in thought for what felt like ages, as if weighing every word she was about to say. After a seemingly endless pause, she spoke, her words surprising Svetlana. "I think you might have just imagined it, honey. In your state, it's easy to misinterpret things." "What do you mean, Mom?" Svetlana couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mother's words felt like a betrayal, as if her own emotions were now being questioned. "In your condition, you need to be rational," her mother continued, gently rubbing her shoulder, trying to soothe her. "Your child needs a father, and you need a husband. You know how important stability is for both of you. You need a place, a home with a nursery. Maybe you just worked yourself up too much. Are you sure you got it right?" He could have just been watching a movie or chatting with a friend. "You didn't catch him in bed with another woman, did you?" "No, but I saw," Svetlana began, but her mother interrupted her, her tone soft but firm. "Sweetheart, millions of men unwind like this. It's normal. The most important thing is that you have a family. You can't destroy everything over something so insignificant." Every word her mother said hit her like a hammer. Svetlana felt like the ground was slipping away beneath her feet. Her mother. She had taken Mike's side. And it hurt more than the betrayal itself. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight barely grazed the window, Susan made a firm decision. It was time to leave. To leave her mother's indifferent advice and the suffocating silence that filled every corner of that space. She needed to return home, to the chaos, the mess, the remnants of Mike's neglect. She knew their shared home was no longer her sanctuary. It had become a battlefield where every discarded item, every piece of dirty laundry, reminded her of his indifference. Quietly, she stepped inside her apartment and was immediately hit by the stifling stench of trash and the cat litter that hadn't been cleaned in days. The place was a disaster, but she knew that before she could sort out her life, she had to clean up this space. "Poor Charlie, how did you even survive here?" Susan sighed, looking sadly at her cat, who seemed just as lost in this mess as she was. She changed the litter, her eyes stinging with tears, and her thoughts drifted back to how fast things had spiraled with Mike. It had been only 2 months after they'd met that they moved in together, and soon after that, they found out about her pregnancy. At first, everything seemed so bright and full of promise. Mike had been caring and reliable, and although he was utterly helpless in everyday matters, she had been willing to overlook that. But now, his helplessness felt like another form of neglect. The entire day was spent cleaning, sinking into the routine that somehow dulled the ache. Every action, tossing out the trash, scrubbing dishes, tidying up, felt like a way to regain control over what she had long since lost. When Mike came home from work, his first comment sliced through the air like a blade. "Got anything to eat?" His voice was rough, as if he hadn't noticed anything different around him. "I didn't have time," she answered wearily, stirring the pasta on the stove. "What have you been doing all day then?" He turned to her, his tone tinged with irritation. "Cleaning. You've been trashing the place all week," she said, barely holding back the tears as her chest tightened with the weight of it all. "Should have left it as it was." "I don't see the difference," Mike shrugged, completely dismissing her efforts as he headed to the couch without a second glance. That conversation only deepened her pain. Something inside her felt like it had finally broken. Susan continued cleaning the apartment in silence, fighting her own thoughts that refused to leave her alone. She couldn't stop thinking about what Mike had done, and her mother's indifference only added to the crushing loneliness she felt. The sense of injustice and helplessness was growing with every minute. After dinner, Mike settled into the couch, flipping on the TV as if nothing had happened. Susan looked around at the piles of dirty laundry and dust still clinging to the living room. She decided she couldn't stand it any longer. Grabbing the vacuum, she began to tidy up the room. "You're blocking my view again," Mike snapped, yanking the vacuum's cord from the socket. "I need to finish cleaning," she answered quietly, trying not to let her emotions show. "Finish tomorrow. Let me watch the game." His voice was filled with frustration, but he didn't even look at her. Susan wanted to tell him that she couldn't stand living in such chaos, that every corner of the apartment, soaked in filth and neglect, weighed her down. But she knew arguing with Mike now was pointless. He hadn't really listened to her in a long time. His gaze was fixed on the TV, barely acknowledging her presence. She noticed how he nervously glanced at the clock, clearly wishing she would just leave him alone. "Maybe you could run to the store?" he suggested suddenly, with a forced nonchalance, trying to avoid the conversation. "We've got snacks, but nothing to drink." Without saying a word, Susan grabbed her jacket and walked out. Her steps were quick, almost as if she were fleeing, though she wasn't entirely sure where she was going or why. The cool air hit her face, calming her burning thoughts just a little. Yet, with that chill came a clarity of purpose. She didn't have to tolerate this. An idea struck her, a memory from her grandmother's old stories, nettles, a sharp, stinging plant used for protection and revenge. A faint smile curled on Susan's lips as she imagined Mike's reaction. Her feet carried her to the nearest patch of nettles. She bent down, plucking a handful, her fingers tingling from their sting. A plan formed in her mind, spontaneous, impulsive, but absolutely right. She headed back home, clutching the nettles in her hand. When Susan re-entered the apartment, Mike was already engrossed in another conversation on his tablet. She could see the way his fingers nervously tapped at the screen. Quietly, she crept up behind him, gripping the nettles with both hands, gathering all her determination. And then, in one swift motion, she lashed them across his back. "This is for you," she yelled, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and relief. "For all your damn games." Mike leapt to his feet, his face a mixture of shock and pain, his eyes wide as he tried to shield himself. But it was too late. The nettles had left bright red marks on his skin, and Susan watched him, feeling a surge of triumph rise within her. "Are you crazy?" he shouted, scrambling to move away from her, wincing as the sting spread across his back. "Maybe," Susan replied calmly, dropping the nettles onto the floor. "But now at least you know what it feels like, when it hurts and no one notices." Her heart was still pounding, but she felt lighter now. This act had given her not just a sense of justice, but a sense of freedom. She no longer felt like a prisoner of her own emotions or circumstances. When Susan, exhausted and broken-hearted, left her home, this time she wasn't heading to her mother's house. She had made a bold decision not to return to the person who had doubted her perception of reality. Instead, her feet took her on a different path. She was going to Mike's mom's house. Her steps were determined, even though her heart was heavy with pain, and each step felt like an emotional marathon. She held her cat, Charlie, in her arms, his soft paws fidgeting slightly, as if sensing her unease, silently offering his support. She took only a few personal belongings, leaving behind a place that no longer felt like home, but rather the scene of her worst nightmare. The streets were quiet, the cold breeze gently playing with her hair. In that moment, she realized she was finally making a decision about her life for herself. And that decision was to leave. No screaming, no drama, no fights. Just leave. When she reached her mother-in-law's house, her heart began to race. She wasn't sure how Mike's mom would react to her arrival, but deep down, there was a flicker of hope for understanding. Knocking on the door, she tried to keep her emotions in check, but as soon as the door opened, her tears fell freely. The warmth in Mike's mom's eyes made Susan collapse into her arms, unable to hold back the tidal wave of pain. "What happened, sweetie?" Mike's mother asked, seeing her distress. "What's going on with Mike?" Susan began to tell everything, starting from the moment she had seen Mike with the tablet and realized what he was doing while she was away. The story was long, surprisingly long, but Mike's mom listened quietly, never once interrupting her. There was pain in her eyes, disappointment, and eventually anger. When Susan finally finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Mike's mom looked at her, and a fire of determination flickered in her eyes. "That scumbag," she said quietly, though her voice was laced with outrage. "How did I raise him like this? What a disgrace." Susan exhaled. It felt as though the weight pressing on her chest was starting to lift. Here it was, the support she had craved. She had finally been heard. Mike's mom, whom she had never considered particularly close, became the very person she so desperately needed. "Stay here, darling," Mike's mother continued. "We'll get through this together. I'll help you, we'll figure something out. I won't take away his apartment, but my own home will go to my grandchild. We'll file for child support, and you'll be able to raise your baby in peace. You're strong. You'll get through this. I believe in you." Feeling such warmth and support, something she hadn't even gotten from her own mother, Susan felt a wave of relief wash over her. She hugged Mike's mom, allowing herself to relax for the first time in a long while. All this time, she had felt so alone, so lost, she had almost given up hope of finding help. But now, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for a new beginning. 3 years had passed since Susan walked away from Mike, starting a fresh chapter of her life. During that time, her wounds healed, and the pains that once consumed her heart faded into distant memories, like scars that no longer hurt but still remind you of past battles. Meanwhile, Mike had hit rock bottom. His life had become chaotic, a mess that mirrored the disarray of his apartment. Loneliness hung in the air, and fleeting relationships left him with more problems than pleasures. Mike, the man who once seemed full of potential and reliability, had watched everything he built with Susan crumble due to his immaturity and selfishness. 3 years later, the reality of his decisions struck him hard, like a bucket of cold water to the face. He realized that his attempts to replace genuine human connection with virtual fantasies had led him to the edge of a deep, dark pit. Now, not only had he lost his wife, but he had also missed out on the chance to be a real father to Colin, their young son, who had been born after their separation. At first, Mike tried to fill the void with casual flings, but they offered only temporary relief. And soon, one of those flings left him with health issues. That was the last straw. He realized he couldn't continue living this way. There was only one thought in his mind: he had to return to Susan and make things right. He wanted to fix their relationship, rebuild their family, and become the father Colin deserved. With this hopeful resolve, Mike headed towards Susan, determined to make amends. But when he finally saw her, reality hit him hard. His expectations had been naive. Over those 3 years, Susan had changed. She was no longer the woman he had hurt and betrayed. She had grown stronger, more self-assured, and crystal clear about what she wanted from life. Colin had grown too. Now he was attending preschool, and Susan had gone back to work, where she met someone new. This new man was everything Mike wasn't. He treated Susan with the respect and love she had long deserved, qualities Mike had never provided. When Mike tried to apologize and win her back, Susan realized that whatever they had shared was long gone. He was a ghost from her past, a memory with no power over her present. One day, her new partner said to her, "He was just obsessed. Trading a woman like you for some virtual nonsense, that's plain dumb." Susan smiled because she knew he was right. Mike was just a reminder of those days that now felt like they belonged to someone else, to a different Susan. The betrayal that once tore her apart now seemed like something distant, almost as if it had happened in another lifetime. Her life had turned around, and now she could look toward the future with clarity, without the need to glance back. She had a new family, a new love, and most importantly, she had finally found herself.